It cost $2.5 million. He needed every penny to save his crumbling palace. Picture it. November 6, 1895. A lavish cathedral in the heart of New York City. Hundreds of candles, the scent of lilies, and the whispers of high society. And at the center of all this splendor is the bride. She is weeping, but these are not tears of joy. Young Consuelo Vanderbilt is being forced to marry a man she doesn't just dislike, she despises him. The price of the deal? Her freedom. The prize? A duchess's coronet. This is the story of more than 100 American women who traded their father's fortunes for British titles, and what they got in return changed two nations forever. Today, we delve into one of the most fascinating chapters of the Gilded Age, the story of the dollar princesses. Between 1870 and 1914, American heiresses crossed the Atlantic with a single goal: to buy their way into the European aristocracy. But this was more than just social climbing. It was a calculated business transaction that saved crumbling British estates and gave American families a prestige that money couldn't buy in New York. The British press coined a nickname for them, the Dollar Princesses, and their stories revealed the true price of a crown. To understand why this happened, we need to look at two worlds on a collision course. In the America of the 1870s and 80s, industrial fortunes were exploding. The Vanderbilts had amassed a fortune from railroads. The Astors controlled New York real estate. The Jeromes were building empires on Wall Street. These families, yesterday's industrialists and financiers, were building palaces to rival European royalty. 70-room mansions, ballrooms for 1,200 guests, dinner parties where the menu cost more than most Americans earned in a year. But there was one thing they couldn't buy: acceptance. New York's old money elite, the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, looked down on this new money. It didn't matter how many millions you had. If your grandfather hadn't sailed over on the Mayflower, you weren't truly elite. While America was glittering with new gold, Great Britain was resting. The landed aristocracy, the families who had run the country for centuries, were in a state of quiet, dignified decline. Their power and wealth were tied up in vast agricultural estates that had generated income for generations. But by the late 19th century, that foundation was cracking. In the 1870s, an economic depression hit agriculture. The development of the American prairies and the invention of refrigerated shipping allowed cheap grain and beef to be imported, drastically undercutting the value of their homegrown produce. Suddenly, land prices plummeted. Rents from tenant farmers, the aristocrats' source of income, dried up. To make matters worse, the government introduced inheritance taxes, or death duties, forcing families to pay out huge sums in cash whenever a title holder died. For an elite whose assets were all land and no cash, it was a disaster. The result was a whole class of men who were land-rich, cash-poor. A duke might own 100,000 acres and a 500-year-old castle, but he might not have the money to fix a leaking roof. The very symbols of their status, the magnificent country houses like Blenheim Palace or Chatsworth, were becoming albatrosses, driving them into financial ruin. These weren't just homes, they were massive operations requiring an army of servants and constant, expensive upkeep. The British aristocrat was trapped. His entire identity was built on a code that looked down on trade, or getting a job like a commoner. It was unthinkable. So what was a duke with a leaky roof and no income to do? He couldn't sell the land, which was often legally entailed to his heir. He couldn't get a job. There was, however, one time-honored solution. He could marry money, and as luck would have it, a whole continent of new millionaires was suddenly desperate for what he had. So the stage was set for the perfect, if deeply cynical, transaction. On one side, you had American mothers, who could spend fortunes to climb the social ladder. On the other, you had British lords, who could offer titles to pay the bills. The bridge between them would be built with wedding vows.
This wasn't some subtle, organic process. It was a full-blown market. The London season, that annual whirl of parties and balls, became the ultimate showroom. Ambitious American mothers would bring their daughters over, sometimes paying a hefty fee to a well-connected but poor aristocratic lady to arrange their official presentation at court. Getting presented to the queen meant you were in the game.
The first major dollar princess set the template for all who followed. Her name was Jennie Jerome. Jennie's father was a financier nicknamed the King of Wall Street and had a significant financial interest in the New York Times. In 1873, he took his daughters to Europe for the social season. The goal was perfectly clear: find them titled husbands. At a ball on the Isle of Wight, amid the glitter of diamonds and the rustle of silk, 19-year-old Jennie met Lord Randolph Churchill, the second son of the Duke of Marlborough. They were engaged within 3 days. The terms of the deal were straightforward. Leonard Jerome would pay out a dowry of £50,000, about $7 million in today's money, plus an annual allowance. In return, Jennie would become Lady Randolph Churchill. But Jennie wasn't about to play by stuffy Victorian rules. She took lovers. Openly. She influenced her husband's career. Directly. She managed her own money. Scandalously. Victorian society was shocked, but Jennie didn't care. Oh, and by the way, she gave the world a son, a boy named Winston Churchill, who would go on to become Britain's greatest prime minister. Not bad for a Wall Street heiress, right? Jennie proved that American women could bring more than just cash. They brought energy, independence, and a refusal to be intimidated by British stuffiness. She rewrote the rules for all the dollar princesses who came after her. But not every one of them had Jennie's freedom. Some were, quite literally, sold. Consuelo Vanderbilt was the most beautiful and richest heiress in America. Tall, elegant, and with a fortune of $2.5 million, that's around $90 million today, every eligible bachelor in New York dreamed of her, including Winthrop Rutherford, the man she truly loved. But Consuelo's mother, Alva, had other plans. She didn't want a mere millionaire. She wanted a duke, and she was willing to destroy her own daughter's happiness to get one. The Duke of Marlborough was the perfect candidate. He had the title, he had Blenheim Palace, and he was deeply in debt. When Consuelo refused to marry him, Alva resorted to extreme measures. She locked her own daughter in her bedroom for days, in total isolation. She threatened to commit suicide if Consuelo didn't obey. She intercepted letters from Winthrop. She told her daughter that marrying for love was selfish and ungrateful. And so, on November 6, 1895, Consuelo, broken but not beaten, walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church, weeping. The New York Times would report that she sobbed through the ceremony. 8 bishops officiated, 2,000 guests attended. It was the wedding of the decade. The contract was crystal clear: $2.5 million in railroad stock immediately, plus $100,000 annually. In return, Consuelo became the Duchess of Marlborough. Her money saved Blenheim. The Duke used the Vanderbilt millions to repair the roof, restore the gardens, and preserve one of England's greatest estates. But Consuelo herself was miserable. The Duke was cold and controlling. The marriage was loveless. She produced 2 sons, heirs to secure the title, and then they lived separate lives within the same vast palace. In 1921, after 26 years of unhappiness, Consuelo finally got a divorce. She went on to marry a French aviator, whom she genuinely loved. And she spent the rest of her life as a philanthropist, using her wealth to help others. And Blenheim Palace today? It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by millions. Consuelo's money preserved it for history, but the price was her youth, her freedom, and her happiness. But some dollar princesses use their fortunes to gain real power. Meet Mary Leiter Curzon, an American who became one of the most influential women in the British Empire. Mary's father, Levi Leiter, was the co-founder of a department store chain in Chicago. His fortune was estimated at $10 million, about $350 million today.
Mary was beautiful, charming, and incredibly intelligent. In 1890, she met George Curzon, a rising British politician with aristocratic connections but no money. They fell in love. Unlike Consuelo, Mary married for love, but also for ambition. George Curzon was brilliant, driven, and destined for great things. He just needed the money to get to the top. Mary's father provided a substantial dowry, but this was not a purchase. It was an investment in power. In 1898, George Curzon was appointed Viceroy of India, the highest position in the British Empire after the monarch, and Mary became the vicereine. At 29, this Chicago department store heiress was ruling over 300 million people.
Mary didn't just host tea parties. She reformed hospitals and funded schools for Indian girls. She negotiated with Maharajas. The British officials were horrified. An American woman wielding real political power? Unthinkable, but Mary didn't care what they thought. But the Indian climate and the constant travel took a terrible toll on her health. Mary suffered several miscarriages and developed a heart condition. In 1906, at the age of just 36, she died. George Curzon was devastated. He wrote that she was the most devoted wife, the most perfect mother, the most loyal friend. India mourned her. Britain mourned her. Mary Leiter Curzon proved that the dollar princesses could be more than just ornaments. They could be world-changing forces. While Consuelo, Jennie, and Mary are the most famous examples, they were part of a huge wave of American women who made their mark on Britain. One of the most remarkable was Nancy Langhorne, a witty and outspoken Virginian. She married Waldorf Astor, and when he inherited his title and had to leave his seat in the House of Commons, Nancy decided to run for it herself. In 1919, she won, becoming the first woman to actually take her seat in the British Parliament. A true pioneer, she was a tireless advocate for social reform and was one of the key supporters of a 1923 bill prohibiting the sale of alcohol to anyone under 18. Nancy Astor proved that an American heiress could do more than just influence politics from the sidelines. She could walk the corridors of power and help write the laws. Of course, not every story was a success. Helena Zimmerman, a Cincinnati brewing heiress, married the Duke of Manchester, a notorious gambler who quickly blew through her entire fortune, proving that a grand title was no guarantee of good character. And then there's Frances Fanny Work, a stockbroker's daughter who in 1880 married the 3rd Baron Fermoy. The marriage ended in divorce, and her father was so outraged that he declared that international marriage ought to be a capital offense. And yet, in a twist of fate, Frances Work's legacy would prove to be hugely significant. Through her granddaughter, Ruth Roche, Baroness Fermoy, she became the great-grandmother of a woman who would one day captivate the entire world, Diana, Princess of Wales. It's a stunning reminder of how the American bloodlines, introduced through these Gilded Age bargains, continued to shape the British monarchy for generations. For the women at the center of these transactions, life among the British aristocracy was often a huge culture shock. They had traded the relative freedom of American society for a world governed by ancient, unwritten rules. The gilded cage was a very real thing. They were surrounded by luxury, but often felt isolated and constrained by duty. Their lives were dictated by a rigid calendar of social engagements and formal dinners. They faced immense pressure to lose their American accents, to fit in, and above all, to produce a male heir. Unsurprisingly, many of these marriages, founded on finance rather than feeling, were cold and loveless. Affairs were common and quietly tolerated, as long as they didn't cause a public scandal. Yet their impact on the great houses of Britain was transformative. It wasn't just about saving them, it was about modernizing them. Blenheim Palace, rescued by Consuelo Vanderbilt's dowry, wasn't just repaired. It was fitted out with modern amenities like electricity and central heating, paid for with American money. These women brought with them an American demand for comfort that changed the aristocratic way of life.
they also injected a new social energy. The stuffy, formal dinner parties of the Victorian era began to give way to more lively affairs. The heiresses, with their confidence and wit, were brilliant hostesses who brought a much-needed dynamism to high society. They introduced American cocktails, new forms of entertainment, and a can-do spirit that gradually chipped away at the rigid formality of the British upper class. The legacy of the dollar princesses is woven into the very fabric of modern British history. It's no exaggeration to say that, financially, a huge chunk of Britain's heritage, its castles and country estates, was saved from ruin by American money. Fortunes forged in American steel and railroads preserved centuries of British history. Socially, these women were agents of change. They challenged the Victorian ideal of the quiet, submissive wife, carving out roles for themselves in politics and philanthropy. Figures like Nancy Astor shattered glass ceilings, proving that an American woman could hold her own in the world of Westminster. Politically, their legacy is best embodied by Winston Churchill. The son of a dollar princess, he was the perfect fusion of British heritage and American drive. It's a fascinating thought. Without the marriage to a New York financier's daughter, the man who led Britain to victory in World War II might never have risen to power. Culturally, their stories have become modern myths. So if you enjoyed this story of how new American money crashed into old-world British tradition, please give this video a like and subscribe for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. Your support helps us bring these incredible stories to light. The era of the dollar princess was a unique, glittering, and often brutal period. It was a grand bargain, a fusion of American dynamism and British tradition that forever changed both societies. They weren't just rich heiresses with big bank accounts. They were women who crossed an ocean not just to gain a title, but to redefine what it meant to be an aristocrat. They arrived as outsiders, their new money often treated with contempt. But through a combination of wealth, wit, and willpower, they became insiders. They revived crumbling estates, influenced politics, and brought a much-needed dose of modernity to a fading world. They may have arrived as dollar princesses, but they left their mark as duchesses, vicereines, and the mothers of legends, forever weaving the fortunes of the new world into the ancient tapestry of the old.